Hey everyone, Trent Kusters here, co-founder and studio director at League of Geeks, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Welcome back. Today we have a very exciting episode for you because I've been speaking to Derek, Jon, and Eirik of the UFO 50 team. Now, if you're not familiar with it, UFO 50 is a collection of 50 games that is just released in one beautiful little package on Steam recently. It's absolutely stunning and a gargantuan undertaking. We kick off talking about where an idea like that even comes from and how Derek and Jon came up with such a crazy idea, and then also how the team came together, how the team formed, because this really is a kind of super group of indie developers, the 6 of them on the project. Then we get into the development of things. How do you prototype 50 games at once? Because that's what they did, not just one after the other. They prototyped 50 games at once. How do you decide what you keep, what you cut? How do you come up with ideas? How do you share them? How do you iterate on them? The team talks about the creative freedoms that actually developing 50 games at once gives you, for a collection as opposed to making one magnum opus. A lot of counterintuitive insights in there. And of course, the creative decisions that they made to honor the technical constraints of the era of the 1980s that they were trying to emulate. Then we finish up with some sage lessons learned from not just working on 50 games, but working with each other. Each one of these developers is a talented, towering indie developer in their own right. And there's some really, really sweet takeaways and compliments in the way that they talk about their collaborators and teammates on this project. There's a ton of insights in here, folks, whether you're a small indie developer or big AAA, seasoned dev. When you ship 50 games, you get a lot out of it and you learn a lot of things, and we hear from the team what those are, whether it be about prototyping, collaboration, how and when you can tell a game is finished, the importance of a united core vision on the team, and even just what the perfect amount of games is to convince everyone that you're certifiably crazy for even attempting something like this. There's a lot in here, like I've said, folks, so please do enjoy. Here's Derek, Eirik, and Jon of the UFO 50 team. Well, usually I say good evening or good morning, but I mean, I think as I referred to it when we were just warming up, we've kind of got like the UN of like game development podcasts here in regards to time zones. I mean, Eirik, you're in Norway. Jon, where did you say you were?
Philadelphia area.
Philadelphia, that's right. And Derek, you're out in Los Angeles, yeah?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, right. Well, thanks for joining me today in all of your respective time zones. I'm super excited to have this chat with you all. I mean, you're all storied game devs in your own right. We could have a podcast on each and every one of you. Like Derek, I know you've been on the podcast before on the Game Maker's Notebook, talking about Spelunky and other things. But we're here today to talk about UFO 50, which is just a phenomenal achievement and accomplishment. And like, it's one of those things. It's like the Jeff Goldblum quote of, Your scientists thought whether they could, but never whether they should. It kind of feels like is the UFO 50 story, but we're here to find out today, folks. So thank you so much for joining us all today on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's get straight into it. On the podcast, as everyone knows, we usually dive into like where you got started in games and everything, but there's a few of you and we've got, I don't know if we're going to go through every game, obviously, but we're going to talk about a game that's also 50 games. So let's just do a quick circle around the room. Derek, why don't you let us know sort of like how you got into games quickly and like where, how you got to here. I know it's a hard thing to compress, what you've been up to for the last 20 or so years or more into this. But yeah, fill us in.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's pretty great that Jon is here because I honestly feel like I got my start basically with him when we were kids. And I've known Jon since the second grade, but we're both very much into video games. And I think basically as soon as we could start kind of designing games, we did on paper. And then as soon as we could start making games using click and play, we started doing that. And the first games that I released were under this label Black Eye Software that Jon and I created together.
Hell yeah.
And we released quite a few freeware games within the click and play community. And it was, the start of the internet. So it was very exciting getting to upload games and have people play them and, try out other people's games in this community. And from there, just kind of kept it going. And, me and Jon, our final game as Black Eye Software was Eternal Daughter in 2002. Mm-hmm. We released that as freeware. And then I just kind of continued making games until I got the opportunity to work on Aquaria and then eventually Spelunky. And that's what led me to UFO 50.
Hell yeah. What a great little run and amazing. Like I did hear that UFO 50 was kind of the two of you getting the band back together again, so to speak. But here we have it confirmed. So Jon, tell me your side of the coin there. Like I've heard a little bit about your story via Derek. You remember those days fondly, I'm sure?
I do. And I'd just say that in addition to making these games with click and play and releasing them online, we spent a lot of time making calculator games and releasing them around our high school. So that was also an early game development story. But yeah, mostly it overlaps with what Derek described, except I took a little bit of a hiatus from games like in my 20s, like in the 2000s, and then kind of made my way back to games via tabletop game design.
Wow.
So I have several published board games that I put out before this UFO 50 release.
Was your tabletop games time, was that the hiatus, or did you get a quote unquote real job before and then you were doing tabletop on the side, or sort of found your way into that and then back into video games?
Well, there was like almost a decade where I wasn't doing much with games at all. I was doing other creative stuff. This is sort of irrespective of whatever I was doing to pay my bills,
Hell yeah! What kind of creative stuff? We love that outside of working outside of the medium.
Oh, I was exploring music for a while. I actually went to film school, so I was
Rad.
making videos for a while. So just all different kinds of stuff before I returned to games. And then I started back in games by actually Derek and I made a card game together called Time Barons. Mm-hmm. And that process was really fun. And then I went on to make a few board games of my own before UFO 50 eventually.
Cool. So UFO 50 is your re-entry into video games?
Pretty much. I mean, I think there was a Diabolica iPhone app that Derek and I collaborated on.
Hell yeah.
Like 2008 or something. But that was a bit of a blip.
Yeah, cool. All right, sweet. Eirik, we're on to you, my friend.
Okay, so similar story. I got started making games with, for me, it was RPG Maker and then Game Maker in my early teens, and started making music also for other people in those communities who wanted music for their...
Ridiculous Fishing, right? You were a composer on Ridiculous Fishing? Am I right in saying that?
I was, but even before that, it's just a bunch of RPG Maker games that never went anywhere, stuff like that. And did that for a bunch of years, and then my story intertwines with Derek's when I joined up to do the Spelunky soundtrack. and then later Spelunky 2, and then UFO 50, and just done a bunch of freelance sound design and music work in between there.
Awesome, man. It's crazy to think like how much of your music like I've listened to just playing Spelunky, like the amount of time I've played Spelunky and Spelunky 2, like you're literally your music, like if it was on Spotify or something, you'd probably be one of like my top artists or something, just there in my ears as I'm delving through the dungeons, through the caves.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. You gotta really not think about that when you're making this.
Yeah, totally. That's the mind virus, thinking about that stuff. Yeah.
Like the choice of note here is gonna affect thousands of people's ears forever. It's yeah. Can't think about it.
Well, cool. Thanks for giving us that little history run on all of you. That's fantastic, as we can hear like some stellar games in there, some really great experiences, and really great this concept of getting the band back together. So let's like dive straight into it. Like maybe Derek, who wants to tell us like where the actual like the first seed of like UFO 50, the idea came about, and like how it all started.
I want to say that Jon and I were at a board game store, and maybe we were talking about Time Barons or testing out Time Barons, that card game that we worked on. And we wanted to just make a video game together again. But the question was, what would that game be exactly?
Yeah.
And since it was Jon's reintroduction into video games, I told him about Game Maker, which for me, it was a lot like Click and Play, where it was this kind of all-in-one game-making tool, and I really liked the workflow for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember just suggesting that he try it out. I thought he would take to it quite well, and maybe just make some prototype games using it to learn it.
Yep.
And I think during that discussion, we talked about how we made games as Black Guy Software, and how, we'd make a game in like a couple weeks or a month and then just release it. And it was a lot of fun, and we really liked that workflow. So I think through that discussion, it just kind of came up that, well, if you're going to be making prototypes in Game Maker, maybe we could just get back into making smaller games again. But this time, instead of releasing them one at a time, just maybe put them together in a collection, and just kind of put all those games out together as like one big package. And that's how I remember it starting out.
Which is interesting because like the sort of era that the game came in, I remember being like playing my NES, and I've sort of said this story a couple of times on the podcast, but generally how I got games as a kid was I would go to the local, like, cash converters, we called it, where people would like trade in their games for cash or whatever. And there'd be like whatever cartridges there for $5 or $10. That's what my pocket money could permit. And there was always these kind of like collections of games as well, like, and what was there was like the Mario like track and field games and stuff as well, and California games and stuff. It is a kind of a theme from that era as well. So it just fits so well with the theme. But before I go off and kind of talk more about the game, maybe Jon, you can give everyone sort of the elevator pitch about what UFO 50 is, because there'll be a bunch of people listening to this podcast just like, okay, we've kind of hinted at it a couple of times now, but they'll have no idea what we're talking about. So what is UFO 50?
Okay, so UFO 50 is 50 games in one. And what you want to do is imagine, an alternate universe where there was this 80s game company that made all these very interesting games that no one's ever seen before. And it's as if we've found this company's work, their collected works over about 8 years, all 50 of their games, and we're presenting them to you. And so you can play all 50 games, and they are all complete games, but they're also of this particular time period. So they have that look, they have that aesthetic, musically and visually, but they also hint at a backstory of the company and the people that made them.
Amazing. And it really does, the whole presentation for our listeners here, like when you boot up the game and you get into it, it's got like the 50 games there and then showing their cartridges and they're all dusty and they've got cobwebs and stuff on them. And when you click on one to play for the first time, it dusts it off and you dive into it. And they're really treated like their own little, standalone apps within this sort of, this base game that's housing them. It's really, really special, the presentation. You can tell that a lot of thought and love has gone into it. But I mean, maybe we could talk about how did you get from like making these little prototypes to, having this concept of 50 games, Jon, and like this, like everything you've just said, like having the canon of this world there. And, because there's a commercial question about, was it a decision because, how does anyone kind of make a commercial living off 50 small games released kind of like, and there are some people doing it out there, but it's tough. But, there's obviously a commercial aspect that we can talk about if there was a motivation there for packaging them up this way and doing a big Steam release of all 50. But let's talk a little bit about the canon and how that came about. Was that just kind of like something fun, or was there a greater intent to sort of pull these together in some kind of meaningful way?
Well, I think once we got serious about this idea of 50 games and we brought Eirik on, and started actually, we had a little private forum where we were brainstorming all 50 of the ideas, right from the start. It's not like we just made one game at a time, right? We kind of went broad right away. Yeah. And so I think that almost immediately that had us thinking about, the larger frame and like the glue that would connect these together. Yeah. And so, I couldn't tell you exactly what conversation it was, but it was there almost from the start that, we would present them as if they were by some single fictional company. It just seemed like, I don't know, it almost seemed obvious at the time, like that was just made sense. I guess it's not though. So, I mean, we still have those forum archives. We could go dig up exactly how we got to that decision.
Look back to us. Yeah. We'll do an update. So Eirik, tell me, you get pulled in by these two. They're doing crazy things. You've obviously worked with Derek before a couple of times. Tell me about those first moments and, when you were approached and like sort of where it was at and your thoughts on what they're up to.
For me, it was really great because I had just made my first game of my own prior to this.
Perfect timing, right?
And it was just like a weird little side-scroller game that I had made as a freeware title. And I knew I wanted to keep making little games, but I didn't really have much of an interest in making big commercial games. And so here comes along this opportunity to keep making strange, smaller-ish games. And then at the same time, do it in a commercial way, or at least be able to justify spending a ton of time on it, right?
Yeah.
So the timing was it's one of those projects where it happens at the perfect time. And I forget if me and Derek had started working on Spelunky 2 or not at that point. I believe they started at about the same time. I don't know if you know, Derek.
Yeah, Derek, let's get a timestamp on when was UFO 50 kicking off?
UFO 50, I think it was 2015 that I was talking about with Jon. And I think Spelunky 2 is kind of brewing also. Like both projects were kind of brewing at the same time.
Just a sucker for punishment. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. I think everybody on the team is a little bit.
Yeah, you made 50 games in one, of course. Yeah, we know, Derek. We know.
We like games. We like making games a lot.
Yeah, we all do. It's amazing.
And, working with Eirik also, I do remember playing Eirik's game that he released called Scorpulac, which was made in Game Maker. Yeah, it was a small game. And it seemed like exactly the kind of thing that we might want in UFO 50. But even before that, just working with Eirik on Spelunky, I knew that with Spelunky, he is known primarily for doing the audio, but I knew that Eirik enjoyed doing and was good at doing like all kinds of things on games. And Scorpulac really just kind of proved like, Eirik can do everything on a game, design, art, music, obviously, and then put it all together. So, and I enjoyed working with Eirik so much on Spelunky. So I was really looking forward to working with him more on Spelunky 2 and UFO 50. Yeah, they're kind of brewing around the same time. And then, I think a lot of it with these projects, I think it just depends on, are the people that you really want to work with and that you really enjoy working with, like, are they available to work with? Because it's so important, right? I think UFO 50 in a lot of ways is, it started as just wanting to make games with these people that you like and respect a lot.
Is there any better reason to make games, right?
Started.
Like it's not what you do, it's who you do it with so much of the time.
I think so. Yeah. And then finding the right project, I think, to work on with everybody.
Hell yeah. All right, well, let's talk about that. So you've got your little crew. Like there's 3 of you at the moment, but before we dive deep into the project, like let's talk about the people that ended up being there. Sort of, if we go, because it went from 2015, it's 9 years kind of development here, and excuse me, at different strengths. Like let's talk about folks that helped you out along the way. Like, because I mean, you had Eirik and you had Ojiro. Let's list the all-stars in UFO 50.
Yeah, so aside from us 3 who kind of got things started, we pretty quickly added Paul Hubens to the team, and then Ojiro, and then eventually Eirik. And as far as Eirik and Paul go, I knew them from the indie game community, pretty much from running TIG Source, starting around 2006.
And for our listeners who wouldn't be familiar with that, what is TIG Source, Derek?
TIG Source is an indie game blog and community that I just happened to be there at the right time to take it over from Jordan Magnuson, who started it. Jordan did a small interview with me about Black Eye Software, actually. And then shortly after, he just couldn't run it anymore. And I was like, I just asked if I could take it over, because I learned so much from that blog. It kind of introduced me to the whole concept of indie games. Yeah. Just, in relation to like the larger game industry. And it was very familiar to me, the idea of making games in small teams, because that's what Jon and I did with Click and Play and being part of the Click and Play community. But this concept of indie games was new, as opposed to, mainstream games, AAA games. And so I took it over and just kind of kept running it. And through that, met a lot of other people who were interested in doing the same thing. And, we would meet at GDC, people from the TIG Source forums. And that's kind of how I met Paul and Eirik and got to know them. And
it's kind of crazy how foundational the TIG Source forums were for a lot of the indie scene and indie devs back in those days. Like, devs that are big names now that people know, kind of like household names in the indie scene, like Lucas Pope is a TIG Source tragic, right? Like, folks hanging out in these forums and these communities and then getting together at GDC.
Yeah, I think that label of indie games was so powerful for people back then to just be like, oh, okay, that's what I want to do. How do I find more people like this? And they could go to TIG Source. And Jordan, in particular, his blog wasn't the only blog about indie games, but his was the only one, from my perspective back then, that really talked about them as art, I guess, rather than, just discussing the business behind how to sell a small game. Jordan really posted about the creative aspect of making indie games and what could indie games do that other games, other types of games couldn't. And so that was really cool. And yeah, it was a great way to meet a lot of people. And it really felt like, to me, it was like the next evolution of the Click and Play community that Jon and I were so familiar with. So it felt very cozy to have that, have that whole community there while working on games and sharing ideas, sharing games. It was like, just the next step, basically.
Hell yeah. And so you were saying that you met Eirik and Ojiro there, was it? Or
I met I met Paul and Tyreek through TIG Source.
Yep.
I want to say I basically met Ojiro through TIG Source also, but Eirik might have been more of the close link to Ojiro as far as UFO 50 is concerned.
Yeah,
Do you remember Eirik?
I had worked on Downwell just prior to this.
There you go.
And so I knew Ojiro, and I knew I really liked working with him, and so it just seemed like a no-brainer to ask him if he wanted to help us make some games, and he did.
Great. So you got your crew. So what time was kind of with like all 6 of you assembled by like, this idea had come around about 2015. Had it taken a couple of years or did it happen pretty rapidly?
I don't know how long it took us to get the first 50 prototypes running, but I want to say it was really fast. Feels like we had 50 prototypes in like a year or something. I don't know. That
might have been the first PAX, I think, that made it, that we brought it to, which I could look up the date, but I don't actually know. But it might have only been a year in, yeah.
It was 2017. I remember PAX was 2017. Right. And I know we didn't have every game available to play, but I think behind the scenes we did have prototypes for most of the 50, if not all. And I think at that PAX, yeah, I want to say everybody was there. Ojiro joined, and also Ojiro joined for about half a year, I want to say, and did a lot of great work during that year, but ultimately just, I think, left because he had his own game making goals that he wanted to pursue, which was fine.
Yeah. So let's dive into the it's just like I'm laughing just thinking about it. It's just madness that you like got 50 prototypes up and going. So I'm really interested in kind of the process and the structure around that. So Jon, like talk me through kind of how this came about. Like where, you've said that you've got this like these private forums that you're working in, chatting about this stuff. You knew that you wanted to sort of like come up with sort of all of the game ideas at once, as opposed to like make one and then the next one or whatever. But how did that happen? Were you throwing ideas against the wall and then people were like, I'll make that one? Or, were they doled out individually? Did you carve up the work? Run us through the sort of the general process of how you even started the prototyping and handled tackling 50 games at once, 50 prototypes at once.
Well, the forum, I mean, and now these days we use Slack, but this was long before we got on Slack. We were just essentially just using one of those, PHP forums. So we had a thread for each game and we started numbering them. So basically, I mean, I think like all game designers, we all have like a backlog of like ideas we'd like to try or that we've like never gotten to noodle on. And so I think, we would just start claiming numbers. So I'd be like, okay, we're already up to 3. So I'm just going to like start the thread that's 4 and I'm going to like put some temp name in there, and like something really generic sometimes like armies or fragile platforms or whatever that's just like hinting at the mechanic. And I'm just going to sort of write down my idea and then other people would chime in and say, oh, that sounds great. Or, what if you also did this with it? And we just kind of jammed it out like that until we had 50 threads. I remember like, as we were starting to get into the 40s, I was like, oh man, I got to get some more in there fast.
It's like slots are running out. Yeah, we get
the slots were getting scarce. So like, I think even now, like in terms of our internal numbering, like I have a lot of games that are like late in the numbering system because of my like last minute rush to get some ideas in.
Hell yeah. So this kind of hints at this notion that you sort of were like capping ideas at 50, which I'm sure may not have been the process. So like, Derek, talk me through the process of like axing an idea or a prototype, or did you kind of just stick with them until they worked? Or because there's 50 games in a bundle, not everyone has to be a 10 out of a 10. What was the kind of philosophy on like selecting the games that actually made it into UFO 50?
I think it started with just interest in the idea, as you're prototyping. I think every game developers familiar with the feeling of, oh, this game sounds so cool on paper. You start working on it, you immediately realize you don't want to work on it anymore. It's a lot more fun to think about. So there was that. And also, I think as we kept adding ideas, I think there was a feeling of just not wanting to overlap too much. If someone else was kind of covering a concept pretty well, I think then there's no reason to have two of that game. Although over time, I think we did start looking for connections between games. So for example, Jon and I both had ideas for games that involved sacrificing your units to get ahead. And those two ideas ended up staying in the collection and then just becoming sequels to each other in UFO 50.
Cool.
So it was, I think it had to do with just personal interest, but also just kind of playing off of and being inspired by what the other people were doing on the team. It had a real game jam atmosphere for, I think, a very long time during development. It was, it's like doing a weekend game jam, but then you just don't stop for years, right?
Yeah, the never-ending weekend. I love it. Endless summer, right?
Exactly. So it had that vibe for, I think, a very long time. I mean, for years, I think it felt like that. And then, I think as we got deeper and deeper, we just started to come together more and more often to just make sure that we're putting everything together in a cohesive way and finding more and more ways to connect it into this singular whole.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I'm keen to dive into that as well because there's just such beautiful things there, like the constraints of the time and everything that we can dive right into. But I'm keen to talk a little bit more about that vibe and that prototyping phase. Like, Eirik, you've had the privilege of working with a number of teams and developers. Was there something specific from that time, that prototyping time, and how these games came together, like how the prototypes came together, I should say, that was like really special about this team, or that you really enjoyed the process of this endless summer searching for prototypes instead of surf breaks?
Well, one of the real strengths of this project is, since we're selling these games or presenting them as a bundle, then none of the games individually need to sort of sustain what's the word I'm looking for? There's no pressure for any of the games individually to sort of cover every base, if you will. And so what that means is it felt like every stupid idea is good enough to make a little fun game out of. And so we ended up with very few discarded game ideas. And the only times we really discarded a game idea was if, for whatever reason, it was too hard to do. If it was either hard technically or design-wise, not impossible, but there were just endless amounts of ripe ideas, essentially. So we knew we needed to keep moving forwards. There was no time to stop and really just sit there and think about something. You need to just pick another route, pick a right grapple, and then run with that instead. And that was really freeing, actually, to just keep moving forwards in that way.
Eirik, do you remember kind of how many prototypes you actually ended up with versus how many? Well, we know how many games you ended up with 50 games, but how many prototypes there were? Was it 60? Was it 127?
I would say we probably have roughly 10 games that were discarded between us.
What a hit rate. That's amazing.
And some of those were cool, but like I said, they were just 10% too difficult to work on compared to some other idea that easily do. Or that some of them kind of overlapped maybe too much with other ideas or things like that.
Yeah. Kind of basic question, but I mean, it's an interesting one. It begs to be asked. Why 50, Jon?
Oh, well, that's really a question for Derek, but I'll just add this, that I do remember like the very first conversation, because it was like Derek described, where we're like, well, we want to work together. We want to make a video game. What's it going to be? And it was definitely Derek that proposed the 50 games. And I will say that I definitely was like, 50, what
You're
about
just re-entering video games.
what about 30, 25? There's a little bit of like an attempted negotiation that Derek shut down pretty quickly. And even I think like after like I agreed to the 50, in the back of my mind, I was like, well, we're going to start making some games. And then pretty soon, like Derek's going to realize that actually like 50 is a bit too much. But that never happened. We just kept going. But I mean, I'll let Derek explain why 50 was really important to him.
Go on, give us the pitch, Derek.
I mean, it's not too complicated. I think it's just the fact that 50 just seemed like the first number that was just completely undeniable as far as, if you're talking about a collection of games, like what's the number that just advertises itself with its own existence,
Yeah.
which just, it sounds a little crazy, right?
Yes.
50,
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's getting into maybe like a little bit of number theory or something like that. But it's like, if you're talking about 40, that just feels like there's so many numbers that feel like they exist in relation to 50. I think when you're talking about a collection, 40 is just
rounding up
below
anyway, right?
50. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I don't know. I think just thinking about how sort of efficiently Jon and I made games when we were kids, I think that I really thought that we were going to be able to channel that energy. I was just very excited, I think, to get to work on, this project with Jon. And so I felt maybe, overly confident at the time.
Hell yeah. Well, let's talk. Look, I'm really keen to dive into and we will the development and everything further on because I mean, like we said, 9 years since its inception now, it's come out, so there's a hell of a story there. But let's talk a little bit more about, now you've got these prototypes. There's a really interesting thing about UFO 50, which is this, what we were talking about before, Jon, you were explaining to us this fictional company and this notion that it's a catalog of games between Jon, what was the time period? Is it 82 to 89 or
82 to 89? That's right.
82 to 89, right? So 1982 to 89, this company, which is called
UFO Soft eventually, although they start out as LX Systems.
Love it. Love the deep lore. It's amazing. But the most beautiful thing about this is that, there's a lot of indie games and a lot of game development that, we might be making games with PS1 graphics and things like that. But, a lot of developers, they take liberties around the constraints that were imposed on a lot of those systems earlier, and which you've done in little places around the place. But it does feel very faithful to the kind of constraints that were imposed upon those games and those developers back in those days. So, Derek, maybe you can talk us a little bit through how that came about and what constraints, why you chose those constraints, why you chose that era specifically, and sort of the first ones that are immediate to you.
I think it felt pretty clear from the beginning that we were going to do 2D pixel art. I mean, just because of the era, I think because of what our experience was, I think it was pretty immediate that we knew that we needed some kind of palette, a color palette, and that was going to be one of our first limitations. I think we wanted to design rules that really hit the vibe, right? But we weren't going to be so restrictive that it slowed down our game development. I think we knew from the very start that we needed the game development to really fly if we're going to make 50 games. And so we couldn't be sitting there. Yeah, we couldn't be sitting there with every sprite being like, okay, does this meet spec? Does that meet spec? We had to be able to just make games. And also make them somewhat separately, at many points in the development where you're working on one game, I'm working on another game. And yeah, so I think powerful, flexible rules is what we were looking for. After the palette, I think the next rule that came up was just the number of colors. Mm-hmm. And so we came up with this rule of every sprite having 3 colors plus black is like a freebie color that you could use. And that was it. I think it was not, there's nothing about like, 3 colors within 16 by 16 pixel tile or something like that. It was just like, roughly we want every sprite, every tile to have three colors plus black. Mm-hmm. And that, I think those initial rules were enough to get us going. And I think that they also just informed the idea that, well, we do have specs of a sort. It makes sense that we're making this for some kind of console, right? Yeah. And that's, that idea kind of developed from that. But yeah, powerful, flexible rules, I think was our main constraint.
Yeah, hell yeah. And this, as we all know as creatives, there's phenomenal stories in games of like, we're an industry bound by constraints a lot of the time and pushing at the edges of those, and like the creativity within it is kind of what defines our medium and our industry and our art form in many ways. But like Eirik, I believe you had constraints on your end as well. Like, were you did you do the music, the composition for all of the games, or was that shared around? Or
I did do all the audio, the sound effects, and the music for all the games. Yeah,
right. And did you have constraints on that as well?
So we ended up doing wavetable synthesis for the audio, which was, we knew we didn't want to do NES sounds exactly because it's so easily identified,
Yeah.
We wanted something in that realm, so we were toying around with whether it would sound like Super Nintendo or like a Genesis, then we landed on the wavetable synthesis, which is what the PC Engine uses for the TurboGrafx 16, which is just slightly more esoteric, right?
Yeah.
And that already has that vibe of sort of sitting in an 8-bit realm, but sounding just a little bit more fancy, a little bit more elaborate. So that gave us a lot.
How did that change your process at all? Or how did you find the creative process working in that way?
Well, I've done a lot of chiptune stuff since forever. So that was just a matter of learning a new sound chip for me. And it's a difficult one. It's a real difficult one. And now after like 500 songs, I'm starting to understand.
World expert on this chipset, yeah.
But the thing with the wavetables is you can draw your own waves. So I wrote a little program to generate waves. And by doing that, we could use unique UFO soft waves, right? So the sound is distinct for our fictional system, the LX.
That's so rad. Wow. Very cool. Something that is noticeable though as well, and both Derek and Eirik have hinted at it, is that the times when you've chosen to eschew a sort of faithful technical like recreation of the constraints and everything here. So Jon, do you remember some that you were definitely like, we're not going to do that, or things that explicitly, like I remember we worked on, I was game director on a game at League of Geeks for many years, and we were doing stepped animations on that game, and there are just moments where you're like, we actually aren't going to apply stepped animations to this particular part because everyone we show it to, they think it's a bug or they think it's a glitch or something like that. Were there decisions that you made throughout UFO 50 in regards to this kind of like paying homage to this, this fictional system in games of that era, where you were like, this technical artifact or constraint from that time just isn't going to play well with our audience, or like Derek said, it's going to slow us down in regards to development? Was there anything that you can remember there?
Well, a small one would be, we had a soft rule that emerged that was, trying to keep all of our text on an 8x8 grid. And it does like creative vibe when it's done. And I think most of the games adhere to that, but there are places where it's like, you know, you got to break out of that grid just to convey the information you need to convey to the player, and
Yep.
have an appropriate margin around the edge of the screen, and just make it a functional thing. So we didn't need to be such purists about like certain things like that were more like, they weren't rules like our palette was like a strict rule, or the wavetable stuff is a strict rule. There was things like that were more like guidelines. Try to do it if you can, and if you like can't find an easy way to do it, then you can then it's okay. Like you can put your text between two grid lines.
Yeah, totally. The experience at the end of the day was what was king here, and what you were heading towards, and everything was sort of guidelines around that. Okay. Now, the other interesting thing about these prototypes, before we sort of move on to the next phase of development, I guess, is like the game does seem kind of like strangely balanced around genres, and even like the spread of which games are multiplayer, which ones are versus or co-op, and things like that. Did you have some kind of overarching sort of like product review that you did at some point in time to be like, oh my God, everything that we've done, like, you're looking through the forum threads, or you're looking at the list of prototypes, and you're like, 50% of these are like platforming adventure games, we need something else, or, we don't have enough multiplayer games. Can this one be multiplayer as well? Was there any kind of like overarching, once you had the 50 prototypes down and you were like, these are the ones we want to go with, was there any kind of sense checking of, the sort of what they look like as a sum of their parts or anything, Derek?
I think there was sense checking all throughout development.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was too often that it was like one moment in time where we're like, okay, we got to shift over. I think it's just constant smaller adjustments and changes and topics being brought up and connections being found just all throughout, all 8 years of development, just constantly would be my impression. Regarding multiplayer specifically, I think we knew we wanted to have multiplayer games in the collection, but we just added multiplayer modes to the games that it made the most sense for.
Yeah.
And then there was a point where we're just getting close enough to exactly half the games being multiplayer that it's just like, well, why not? Let's maybe try to find a few more places to add multiplayer to it.
Yeah, cool.
Just so we can hit like 25 out of 50 and be able to say half our games have multiplayer. It'd be kind of like that. But yeah, no, product review. I mean, if anything, there was just a review like constantly going between all of us at all times.
And you remember like a few times where it was like, feels like we need a driving game in here. It just feels like we need an isometric game, or just like we need a game with a level editor. It's just like tiny things that felt like, if we had that also in this collection, that would be really cool.
Yeah.
And then we'd add it.
And you're feeling that out along the way, as Derek was saying, like just catching those vibes of, in the conversation. It's like, we haven't spoken about a strategy game or something yet. Yeah, cool.
Strategy games, we were pretty well covered. I think particularly, since Jon comes from a card and tabletop background.
Yeah.
And so, I think we were pretty well covered to start, I think, because of our interests. And I think everybody just implicitly didn't want to make too many of one game anyways. And we were keeping an eye on what other people were doing. So I think everybody was on the same page as far as, we're going to make 50 games. There should be variety here.
Okay. Cool. So maybe Jon, you can sort of help me and our listeners understand, because I mean, it's a long portion of development that we're talking about, a long, development stage of, from announce to release. Is there some kind of, if you zoomed out, even if you didn't mean this on purpose, if you like zoomed out and looked at those, those 9 years from a bird's eye perspective, was there kind of like a prototyping phase for the first 2 years, then you moved into production and you kind of tackled 5 games at a time or something? Is there some way that we could like tackle sort of chatting about this in phases, or should we just go into like, you've got a bunch of prototypes, what's next?
Gosh, there were kind of phases. It's pretty loose though. I mean, definitely. So it already came up that, we had this early PAX where we wanted to have all 50 games. Like we didn't end up showing them all at the PAX, as Derek said, but we did get them all to a functional place. So there was like a rush to just get all 50 to some kind of like playable place.
Yeah, great.
I remember at one point we set a benchmark that was like, well, you have to be able to win and you have to be able to lose. Like maybe it's only one level, but like it has to have like these like basic like start and end to it to be like considered like done enough to move on to the next phase. And then there was like a very long stretch that was us working largely individually, and I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I think we all kind of did some version of this. I know I definitely would work on one game at a time. So my entire mind would be like deep in just one game for sometimes a few months.
Yeah.
And it was almost like I would forget the rest of the collection even existed because I'm so fixated on, solving the problems of this one particular game. And that was like, basically the period of time when we were getting a lot of the games to this stage of being like more complete.
Right. So there was kind of like you would do games in stage. You wouldn't try and like finish an individual game and then move on to the next. You'd kind of try and move along to one, get it to that next stage of more complete, and then move on along to the next one. Or was it more organic?
Well, I think in that middle phase, we were kind of doing serially one game at a time.
Yeah.
Right. Like the early phase, we went really broad. We got everything up to prototype state. And then, each game would get its little like focused period when it would be made, kind of complete, right? Not polished in any sense.
Gotcha.
And then of course then there was like a third pass where everything got a lot of polish. But I mean, this is all very like vague stuff, right? Like a lot of this, like, I mean, it's not like we really planned this out. I think every once in a while we'd have a deadline, and that's what would like think really like PAX or actually really late in development. We were actually pretty close to the finish line. We had this like edge feature that was coming up, and that was like really like forced us to hit a milestone, which was just like getting all 50 games into one build and running was like felt kind of an obstacle. So I don't know if that answers your question or doesn't exactly give us a framework to go from, but
no, that's all right. We've got the best thing is we can pull on Derek and Eirik and see if their experiences or their, like you said, whether they were tackling the same thing. So Eirik, was your kind of process similar? Do you remember that time in a similar way?
I think so, yeah. I do remember, so we would keep tabs on our collective progress. And I do remember sort of going from 0 to 50, maybe 3 or 4 passes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like beta 1 or beta 2, or I forget what we called these milestones exactly. But yeah, all prototypes and then all sort of full and then all truly finished. And for me also, there's the final pass was doing all the audio in addition to all of the polishing.
Yeah. And so Derek, is the same for you? Were you kind of like, was there a way of, like Eirik says, kind of, was there a master document that, you were changing cells, like, on the status of each project or something, or?
Yeah, pretty much. We had a spreadsheet that had, all the games on it and, various goals for each game, and then we slowly filled it out green. And yeah, we'd have these bigger goals that we're all trying to hit, but I think we'd maybe sort of tackle them in slightly different ways. I mean, now that I think about it, I think it's kind of funny because I feel like the approach of making 50 games, I think, is a little bit of a personality test. I think in the same way that the playing of the final collection is also for people. It's just like, do you start with one game at a time? It's just, you're asking that question really made me think. Yeah, some people play UFO 50 one game at a time, complete one game, move on to the next. But you can also jump around. I think for me, I would tend to grab like a handful of games, put them in one project, and actually just kind of jump around between them until they all met the next kind of level of completion for our goal. and then I move on to like the next 5, because for me it was just a lot easier to have multiple games together and be able to, like, if I was just banging my head against one game, be able to quickly jump to another one. And you can play the games like that too, which I think is, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was the type, I'm kind of halfway in between, where I didn't finish a game, but I definitely played them in order. Like I would play a game until I kind of like hit a wall or thought that I was like, oh, I'll come back to this one, or I'd seen enough of it to understand it, or I like, had a few win conditions and stuff. And I'm like, okay, onto the next one. And then, just move through them in order, like religiously, one through. I didn't get to 50 yet, but yeah, move through them. It's a lot of fun. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about that process of actually developing the games. You're in sort of like the dev cave. Like what kind of, I mean, there's 50 of them, where there's some games that were like done by 2018, and then like Derek, had you knocked off 5 that were pretty much complete by 2018, and then there were some that were limping across the line, like as you're putting it in a box, earlier this year or something, like, or like let's talk a little bit about the actual sort of development itself, and sort of obstacles encountered along the way and things like that.
It felt to me like the games kind of came up together. I don't think there was a game that was just like done and then we didn't touch it, although the games obviously do vary in size and just like the amount of content. So for sure, there were games that just had a lot more content because they were like an RPG or something like that, and took more time in that way. But then at the same time, I feel like the smaller games, require more design work to get them really balanced, because they're so tightly made. It's like small changes really make a big difference, and getting that balance right is more difficult, because it's like, the more content you have, in some ways, I think the looser you can kind of be about little imbalances here and there, or the flaws, I think, feel more like fun quirks and character traits to the game versus problems. So, but it kind of felt like, to me at least, that all the games kind of came together around the same time toward the end of development.
Okay, cool. And when sort of was that? Was there like Jon, when the games came together, what time was that? And then was there a bunch of work that you had to do sort of after that, like boilerplate stuff that exists in this kind of, in film we'd call it a frame narrative, right? But like, the frame narrative, or the the framework of the actual base game that they're all sitting in, and you've got the garden and things like that. Was there a chunk of development that was kind of like post-production or something before you shipped, or were the games were you doing that along the way as well, and then the games came in at the end too?
I would say like a high proportion of like that stuff, like the garden and the fleshing out of the backstory and all that stuff did happen, I think, in the final year or year and a half, out of necessity, because it's, again, just getting the games made, like I'd be working on a game and really focused on that one game and solving its problems, and I'm not seeing the whole forest at that point. And I don't think any of us were able to that easily. And it's just like you almost just can't take in the whole thing, because if you do, it's like paralyzing, and you'll lose your motivation to keep going. So it's like, just heads down, like one game at a time. And it was only like, I think, when all the games were feeling, I think, pretty complete, that like we really started getting into the heated discussions about, all this extra stuff that ties it all together. Exactly, the ins and outs of how the library works, the filtering, the garden, the meta story, and all of that. So even though like a lot of that stuff is stuff we knew we wanted, a lot of it was like, a lot of the actual hard work, I think, had to be pushed towards the end, when we could actually see everything.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? You know what you've actually got and what you're working with there. And so, just again for our listeners, Jon, what is the garden?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the garden it's a place inside the library. When you first visit it, there's a little character in there called Little Buddy. Has a little house and a little garden, and he's just kind of roaming around there, living his life. But as you play UFO 50, and continue to explore the various games, you can give Little Buddy these gifts. And so if you check back in there every once in a while, you'll see, maybe he's got a telephone now and he can call his friends. So yeah, it's like, I mean, yeah, that's the best description I can give.
Yeah, that's it. We're trying to spoiler free as well. We're trying to very cool stuff. Eirik, this process of like closing off the games and, getting to this point where you could then, have a bit more of a talk about like the capsule that they come in and, the meta narrative, the meta progression, meta game and stuff. Was there, talk to me about sort of like the playtesting process, Eirik, and like actually sense checking each other's games and everything. Was it kind of like at any point in time you could, just pull something down from Git and have a play, or jump into a build and check out what people were working on? Or did you have these like reviews where you would all come together and play the games together? Did you bring in, the beautiful thing about, the communities that you're all involved in is, right, the incredibly phenomenally talented designers and developers that, you're surrounded with. Did you have friends come in and play test things? Obviously you did packs and stuff. What was tell us about the playtesting environment on UFO 50.
So for the most part, all these builds just existed in zip files, and we would just pass them back and forth as
it's funny because you all smiled when I said Git.
Yeah. What's that? And yeah, for the most part, we just played each other's games pretty much all the time. Like someone would put a build up and then everyone else would play it.
Yeah, great.
We'd give each other feedback, and later on we would bring in friends and other testers, but we got a lot of good mileage just out of playing each other's games, I think. Yeah.
Hell yeah. All right. Let's do it. Let's get into the actual specific games, because there's there's exactly 50 of them in the game. I'm really keen to hear from each of you, like some dev tales from a specific game or something. Like Derek, do you have a specific game that comes immediately to mind as your problem child?
Problem child. I mean, the first game that comes to mind is maybe Grimstone, just because it was so massive. And I worked on that a lot with Paul. Paul did a lot of...
Grimstone is an RPG for everyone listening, right?
Yeah, it's a Wild West RPG. So that game, I just remember doing pass after pass with Paul. And it's just like, it can take like a couple dozen hours to play through it. So it's just really hard to test it. I just took multiple passes, and I just content wise, that one was a big problem.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
And what about,
I think just programming all the menus and things like that, I think there are just so many places to like introduce little bugs with the menu.
Snag yourself on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that was a prickly one.
All right. What about the opposite? What about, and I'm going to ask Eirik and Jon these same questions so you two can start thinking. What about the opposite? What was your favorite child, or what's your favorite game? Or actually, no, let's not talk about favorite game in regards to finished product. Like what was just the easiest one to come together? Like you put the idea down, and those games that write themselves essentially. Which one came the easiest to you?
The one that came the easiest to me, I mean, I'm tempted to pull up our Slack and actually look through the list to try to figure out which one that might be for me. I'm not sure which one was easiest, actually. I think because, particularly since they all got a lot of help, I think, from the other people on the team. And so I think having that help made them all like a lot easier.
Amazing, just because of the way in which you're all working.
Yeah, I think so. Just because, if I'm having trouble with a game, and I feel like for most games, I can think of at least one place where, I was getting a bit stuck maybe, or just having some trouble, like putting that final bit of polish on it. You just know that you can kind of pass it over to somebody else. And, you feel completely calm and relaxed about that. You trust them, and what you're going to get back is just going to be a lot better than what you gave them. Like Pilot Quest, for example, it's like a mix between a top-down action game and an incremental game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just balancing the incremental part where the game is kind of collecting resources for you, and then the action part where you're going out into the wild zone and completing dungeons and finding special items and things like that was tricky. But yeah, I just remember there was a point where Jon took Pilot Quest and just did a bunch of balancing on it. And I hadn't actually, I think I hadn't actually worked on the game in a while, but I just remember getting it back and it just felt like so much smoother. So I think that was a really cool part of this project, is not just having these games, but just being able to like hand a game off and see what it was like when it came back.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Jon, were you doing his homework in junior high as well, or?
No. Although I definitely have memories of doing homework with Derek, but he could do his own homework just fine.
Yeah, no doubt. No, it's such a beautiful way to work. And it's like, I can't remember what game or developer was talking about. It was, it was a big AAA game, and they were talking about how getting stuck on a feature, if you're like the head of a feature team, the producer would take it off you and give it to someone else. And then they would get to own it for like one sprint or something and hand it back. And at the start, everyone was a little bit like, oh, I don't know about this. But then immediately the results were so positive that like it just became tradition at this company. I can't remember which one it was or what game, unfortunately. But it's a similar kind of thing, right? Where it's like someone actually can come in, and that outside perspective can just like help, especially when you got 50 games and you're saying momentum is so important to you, like having someone come in and lend a hand or do some little balancing or help, liberate you from a problem must have been hugely, hugely enjoyable in this project.
I will say, you mentioning homework does make me think of a funny anecdote, which is that when Jon and I were kids, I do remember a time where we were both in the same English class and we got a creative writing assignment. And, we're each supposed to write a story and turn it in. And what we did instead was that we each wrote one paragraph and then swapped stories. And then the other person would write the next paragraph, and then we'd switch again. And we did this with another friend, actually. So it was the three of us. But then we just, turned those in as our individual projects, which actually, now that I think about it, is very similar to how UFO 50 works.
If I could just add to that story, if I recall correctly, the teacher loved one of those stories and kind of really didn't like another one. But it was just sort of accidental who they ended up being assigned to, because really they were by all three of us. So it was like pretty funny.
Yeah, she's like, Jon, you really gotta lift your writing to Derek's level.
Yeah, it's something like that. Yeah, I forget like whose was who got the good one, but yeah.
Amazing. All right. Well, Jon, like, did you have a problem child on the project, or something that sticks out that?
Yeah. I guess two real quick that just come to mind. First, Avianos was a game that was originally a calculator game.
Oh, right. Wow.
Or like parts of it were. And so like the first time I made it, like was sprinted to get it up and running for PAX. I had adhered a little closely to the original calculator game, and it just like, it had some interest, but I really didn't think it was working. And it had this like very slow, like almost JRPG style turn-based combat that was just like a real slog. And I I ended up like rebuilding that game almost entirely from scratch. Like maybe not. I mean, given how long this project was, it might have even been 2 years later that I just like I don't think a single line of code is still the same from those PAX days.
Wow.
And like the combat works completely differently now. So that one was like a bit of a and yeah, I guess I won't give more examples, but like there were a couple other games that were like that, where just sort of getting the design right took a few passes. And I think what Derek said is true. Like, passing games between us is really helpful. So like, for example, like I passed Mini and Max to Paul, and he really helped out a lot on that. But I think there's also, with such a long project and so many games, there was this cool thing where you can almost pass it to yourself in the future. Right? Like,
right, with Avianus, right? Like
yeah.
when you came back around to it, was it because you had like a bolt out of the blue and you're like, oh, and you like then went back to it? Or was it because you're like, we meet again. Okay, like, am I going to win the battle this time, sort of thing,
It was more the second thing, but you have those fresh eyes, right? And like, you're just not, whatever baggage you had or like roadblocks that you had, over a year ago, last time you looked at it, are now gone. So it's like, if you take each of these games and you add up like just the time spent on those games, it's, I don't know exactly what the math would be like, how like many months each game got.
Yeah.
But I think effectively they got a lot more than that in terms of like effort, because there's all of that. Like, let's say a game like really only had 4 or 5 months of dev time total if you added it all up. But it's like it really got more than that because of all the like gaps in between working on it, where you're like subconscious is like working it out.
Absolutely. We when we worked on Armello, it was like 7 years from the first time we uttered the words Armello to release, and it became very apparent to us when we were making our second game how much Armello benefited from that time that you were talking about. Like, because we were making it out of hours, we had day jobs like at the start and everything, and like the time that just one system is kind of like sitting there on to the side or on the boiler or whatever, and you're slow cooking it in your brain is super interesting. But then also, I think what you're talking about too, like, correct me if I'm wrong, is this kind of compounding interest that you get from working on so many games alongside it as well. And as a developer, like when I talk about that compounding interest, I mean of your experience and of your knowledge of like knocking these games out, so that when Jon 2 years in the future, 3 years in the future loops back around to something, you've just developed 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 other games in the meantime when you're coming back to this one.
I think that's true. And I think that's true just on a practical level, just with like the programming tools as well, right? You just get way faster at certain things. Like, I mean, 8, 9 years, whatever this was, it's a lot of time to build skills, Like, I think we're all extremely, I think Eirik said this the other day, but yeah, we're all extremely good at making UFO 50 games now.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's something to be said about just making games in general. I've spoken often on the podcast about, the fastest way to get good at game development is to just go through that pitch to ship cycle as many times as possible, right? And it doesn't need to be Halo with a, 7-year dev cycle or whatever. It can be 50 small games. So you've effectively gone through that pitch to ship cycle, each of you, 50 times in parts, and probably led, development on, 10, 15, 20 of your own games as well. The upskilling there is just going to be immense.
Yeah, it was one of the many things that made this actually possible, I think, was that effect.
Totally. All right, Eirik, tell me about dragons that you had to slay, or any anecdotes of problem children, or traumatic memories of a game giving you a tough time, bullying you.
So one that sticks out to me for slightly different reasons would be Onion Delivery, just top-down racing game where you're delivering onions, and you're driving around this huge city, and the huge city is the problem. So Paul helped out a lot with making that initial city. And then as I was developing the game, I made some realizations about the geometry, what worked and what didn't work. And then just because of the size of this city, making any kind of gameplay change to that just meant weeks of like sitting there and clicking and dragging and dropping and fighting against the interface in GameMaker, which was struggling because of the size of this map. It was a real grind to just try and get that as smooth as possible, and it really sort of limited the amount of iterations that I could do to the design, because I knew, okay, if I change this one thing, then I'm going to have to go over the whole city and tweak it and tile it and everything, and it's going to just take weeks of clicking here.
It's a good one. Yeah, I love it. Just like this straight up like technical and artistic like challenge of that. Okay, now there are three other people obviously that we've spoken about who are involved in this who aren't around. So I'm actually going to ask each of you to speak to, you know, something that you either learned from them or like, you know, like a game of theirs that they loved, or a way that they work, or a time when they saved you or something. It's like the compliments box for like each one of these guys who was on the project. So I'm going to go to you, Derek and Tyreek. Like, tell me about working with Tyreek and like something that he brought to UFO 50 that you think is just like singularly him.
Tyreek is great. He is extremely good at a lot of different things. I want to say he's maybe our strongest programmer, but he's also an excellent pixel artist.
Mm-hmm.
I think always just brings like a very unique perspective to each game that he works on. Very creative writer. Also, he wrote just a lot of really fun dialogue. You know, for Golfario, which is one of the games. So there are a few games of that I started off directing, that I concepted, and then Tyreek joined, and they were larger games. And Tyreek, by the end, was pretty much co-director of the game, because just he had done so much work in building the game out and directing it. And Golfario is one of those games. It's basically like a top-down action adventure Metroidvania-ish game where you play a golf ball, and the fantasy world is essentially like this fantasy mini golf course.
Yeah,
and you go in a hole and it takes you into this underworld. Those are like the dungeons. And Tyreek, you know, among many other things, I think there are, you know, technical challenges, I think, with making the ball feel good as it's rolling around, and he did a lot of the programming work on that. But he also just came up with a lot of fun lore as to, why are you a golf ball in the first place? Like, what is this? How does this golf fantasy world work?
Tyreek asking the important questions. I love it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, because when I started it, it was just the idea of playing golf in this open world kind of way was interesting to me, but I had no idea why you were a golf ball. And he created some really interesting characters like the par bots, which are these parrots that are monitoring you, and they're under the command of spoilers, but there's a cyber gopher at the end of the but lots of just, I think great puns also, like the starting town is called Putterton, and I don't know, just lots of great golf puns that really work really well. And so, it's a lot of fun to work with Tyreek on games like that, for sure.
Is there some way that Tyreek worked, whether small or large, that, you know, you think you'll take with you moving forward onto other projects, or you're just like, that's the way to do this particular thing, or the energy or the way that he thought about things?
I think Tyreek was very good at just connecting all the parts of a game. And that's a skill that game designers have, where, whenever I see it, I always just am very inspired by that,
Yeah.
And I think it has, taking mechanics, themes, and just creating, I think, really interesting characters. I think Tyreek's character design, and location design is really cool. I think finding those connections to make those things work is really great. And programming wise, I definitely learned a lot about Game Maker from Tyreek. Tyreek was the one that pushed us to move from our aging PHP form onto Slack. Also, it's kind of like a small, but honestly changed the course of development quite a bit, just because it was like, just made communicating on all these 50 games like way easier.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Did you have just out of quick interest, like, just a little deep dive into like Slack processing? Did you have a channel for each game that you were like diving into and stuff? Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, cool. Great. All right, Jon, let's do Paul. What is like, tell me what you learned from Paul, something, one of these games that you loved, or give him a shout out, give him a compliment. I'm keen to hear.
Well, I mean, the game that Paul directed, Night Manor, like is one of my favorite games, easily, so it's easy to give Paul a compliment. But in terms of like working with him, Paul is like really strong at something that is like one of the harder things for me. I'm very much like a systems person. So like I can like happy to think all day about like generally like how like the broad systems of a game work and like work on the programming of that. But like when it comes to like filling in content, like actually like slapping tiles down and constructing a level or something, it's like things like that I just are much more likely to make me like blocked, and lock up. And like Paul just has this ability to just breathe that stuff like out. Like I don't even know how to put it. Like he can just like puts like, pen to paper, metaphorically speaking, like very quickly, and like generate that content that I find like a little bit difficult myself. So like I had a lot of good collaborations with Paul, where I would, I'd build a game systems and I have like all these cool things that interacted, but I just like, I needed a bunch of levels to be built. And it's like perfect time to call in Paul. And like for narrative stuff too, I think he's also great. So yeah, I mean, and just his like, his enthusiasm, just like throughout this process too, is I think a pretty infectious.
It's such an important quality to have in game development. I mean, like we've all been in that valley of despair in the middle of a game, and you guys are making 50 at once. I'm sure the need for, Derek, you were talking about the importance of like the folks that you're making this with, not just, what you're doing or we all love making games. We've got that particular mind virus, right? But when you're doing it with great people, it just makes such a difference. That infectious enthusiasm for things is just so great. So sorely needed, in the game development process as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right, Eirik, you've worked with Ojiro before as well. So I think you're very well positioned to talk about. I mean, I met Ojiro maybe in 2014. Downwell was about to come out, or maybe it was a year earlier in Tokyo at an indies night. And just like, I was just blown away. Like, I'm sure the first time you guys saw Downwell, it was a similar sort of experience. Such a refreshingly rad game, very fucking cool. And Ojiro is just such a lovely dude. Tell us about what he brought to UFO 50. What you love about working with Ojiro.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, he's just a super nice dude. So he's cool to be around. But
yeah,
then
it makes it easy, right? Yeah.
Has a very distinct and cool style in his art and in his execution of the games, and in the kinds of games that he chooses to make. They're very distinct, and you can see it clearly in the game that he directed for UFO 50, Seaside Drive. It reeks of Ojiro. But then also other than directing that, he mostly helped do some level design and some work on some of the games that I directed.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I was birthed out of the same black woods in Norway that birthed black metal. So, I mean, I like cold, dark, slow, and boring, and despair. And then Ojiro infused my games with some goofiness and some speed and some fun. For example, one of the games that I directed, Mooncat, is just super chunky and strange to play. And one of the first things he did when I sent him that zip file was he added the ability to run in that game, which was great, but it's not something that I had thought of. Another one is in Campanella, which is another game that I directed. He added a couple of bosses, one of which is, well, it's a game where you're a little UFO, fly around. He added a boss where you play basketball.
Right.
It's just that kind of left field energy, I think, is really awesome. And he added a lot of that.
Yeah, feel's a great way to put it. Like, feel energy is such a, like, I mean, it's there in Downwell. I think that's I didn't have the words for it until you just said it. But yeah, that feel energy that you get from the moment that you first touch Downwell or watch someone playing it is so rich. I love what you're saying as well. So basically you're saying you're the Scandinavian winter to his Tokyo summer, right?
Exactly.
Fantastic. Cool. All right. Well, look, we're getting close to closing out this episode. I just can't let you know, we've got so many developers, so many folks who work in the industry or just hobbyists or people starting off making their own games. I cannot let you guys get out of here out trying to pull some lessons out of this process about prototyping or making games. I mean, Derek, you wrote a fantastic book on the work you did on Spelunky and that process and everything. Maybe you could start off by telling us what are some of the things that you learned through UFO 50 about game making that surprised you, or some lessons that you could, pass on to folks, not necessarily about needing to make 50 games or whatever, but just about game making in and of itself. Did you stumble across some truisms that even all your years making games that you kind of learned through this process?
I mean, I don't know that this is a new lesson per se, but I think this project really reinforced for me just how important it is to work with people that you get along with, that I think not only, share the same core vision, but I think it's important that everybody, it's not necessary per se, but I think I really appreciated how, even though we were all kind of focusing on this task of making 50 games, that everybody had, things that they were slightly more focused on or meticulous about, and cared about a little more than everybody else. And I think because of that, I think you learn so much because someone else just has a perspective on something that's just slightly sharper than yours. But also I think it just meant that the final product was just meticulous all over, Yeah. I mean, for example, we were talking about the specs and the authenticity of the collection as a whole. And I think, Eirik was so meticulous about that, not just in terms of the audio, but also in terms of the artwork, for example. Mm-hmm. And I was always excited when I would pass a game over to him, and, I pass it over to him to mostly add audio, for example, maybe in one pass. But I always knew that he would also make slight adjustments to just the way things looked or felt like a character. Just minor things that I would probably overlook myself, I'm going to have this character blink slightly slower or at this rhythm. Or I'm going to put a slight pause before this action occurs. And I just knew I would get it back and I'd feel the difference, right? It might be hard to even see all the changes that he made, but I'd feel it. Or, Jon, I think he's very meticulous about making sure that the details of our fictional UFO soft were in place and made sense and consistent and interesting throughout the project, I think, more so than anybody else too. And so I feel it's both important to really have that shared overall vision, but then to, have these deviations as well is also super important.
Yeah, that core overlap, but with those complementary strengths and areas and virtues where you can sort of move towards that united vision.
Yeah, exactly. I think especially across such a long-term project, that was super
Yeah,
important. Yeah.
absolutely. What about you, Jon? I mean, you're diving back into video games, pretty much like after a decade or so from being away from it. Now you've banged out 50 of them, right? Like another decade later, it's a pretty good hit rate. Even if you did make them on your own one by one instead of a big package with your mad mate Derek, right? Like it's still a crazy, crazy not strike rate, fire rate here. So like what have you learned? Like tell, what can you pass on to folks about the game making process that you really feel is, you've come out of this with, as Moses with the stone tablets?
Well, there's a mentality that was essential for making this many games that I would like to carry with me forward, and I think is maybe useful for other people to think about, which is just like, because we didn't need every game to be everything to everyone just inherently, and because there wasn't time to do that, there wasn't time to like do everything in one game. You gotta get to the next one, right? It really forced a certain amount of focus with each game, and I'm a big believer of that anyways, that just like, it's really good for a game to have a strong core, like to it, like some aspect that is something you're really trying to accomplish or say with that game, and like really, adhering to that. And I think, I mean, that's not to say that like games can't be much like broader and messier than that. And I think there are games that are that messy quality that I think is actually very cool. But at least I know for myself, like having to make games for so many at once, like really forced that particular style, I think, where it's like no game really could sort of like waste time, like doing stuff that was like too far afield, nor did it need to, again, because it's like there's 49 other games. So you don't one game doesn't have to be everything. And I think, I'll have to see, like when I make another game after this, like, there's going to, like, when you're making one game at a time, there's a lot more pressure, to like, to lose that mindset and to start, throwing all kinds of stuff in there that doesn't need to be there, and also makes your development way longer. So it's like just trying to figure out how to take that focus that in a way was forced upon us. Well, I mean, we forced it upon ourselves by choosing this insane project, and just carrying that forward, like not letting a game stray too far from its core, I guess. I don't know how to put it better.
No, I totally understand what you're saying. And it begs another question that I want to dive into this a little bit deeper, which is like, it's kind of, it can be lost in, just the fact that you've made 50 games, right? It sounds, as you said, Derek, it's a large enough number that it sounds crazy, right? It's great. It's impressive. You all sound certifiably insane by even trying to tackle it. But within that is the fact that you, like, and I use this word specifically, finished 50 games as well, right? Like these games aren't half done. They all feel like they are their own little standalone product that could have been released to this console in 82 to 89. Jon, in your experience of closing out these games, which we all know famously, the saying goes, 95% of the game is in the last 5%, right? Like, is there something that you sort of saw or that you've learned throughout this process of closing out so many games that sort of marks a game as done? Like, I'm sure every game is its own beast. You worked across so many different genres, but is there something, here that makes you, know that a game is done? You're like, okay, we can put this one down, especially considering what you just said, where you're not pressured for each game to be this magnum opus, of your career on its own,
Well, that is, it's tough to be done with something because it can always be better. But I do, because I try to have some kind of like core vision for a game. It's not like I write it down or anything. Like I kind of know if it's accomplishing that or not. And
what
so once it's accomplishing that, I can just say like, well, that's what I set out to do. It's doing that, maybe not all the details are perfect, but at that point it can kind of feel done. in some cases, I mean, I'll concede though that with this project with so many games, there's some games where it's like, I think it maybe fell slightly short of like that, whereas if I was going to release the game on its own, maybe I would have cooked it a little bit more, but like, that wasn't an option here. So
There's also
something to be said for just, you gotta, when it's done, or when time runs out, you gotta move forward and make more games and not labor over the same one forever.
Totally. All right, Eirik, what about you? What have you learned from this, process that you feel you could pass on to other folks as a little game development truism or something that you'll take with you on everything that you make after this?
I think my single biggest lesson has to do with intuition. It's maybe a little bit hard for me to quantify this yet, but there's so many times while we were making these games that I just felt something very strongly. I had a very strong opinion about whatever, and the other guys might disagree, and we would argue about it. And then in trying to explain why this mechanic needed to be this way, I would learn a lot about why I felt this specific way. And I would see that actually this is cool because of A, but it's also cool because of B and C and D. And it turns out this idea I actually feel even stronger about than I thought before I try to explain it. And that happened to me so many times that I feel like I have a real great trust of my own intuition. And I don't believe that intuition is like a God-given thing. I think it's merely just the result of trying to solve similar problems a million times, and then you end up getting some kind of automatic response. But I feel like all the coolest things that I have done in UFO 50 have all come from that place of sort of non-consciousness, or it's just something you feel. And that has always led me to the good stuff. So I'm just gonna try to really trust that feeling going forwards.
It is really great advice, trusting your intuition. I think all of us as game developers, have had particular degrees of success, can think of numerous times when our intuition has been, warning us about something or leading us down the golden path. The question here, I guess, for, sort of developers just starting is, because we've also trusted our gut sometimes and our intuition has been off, or earlier on, like, Eirik, how do you, this intuition that's, led you down the golden path so many times on this project, and coming off the back of it and saying, yeah, the one lesson is like really trusting my intuition more. How do you feel you've built and nurtured that intuition? Where do you feel it comes from? Like, do you think it's like your upbringing, or do you think it's being exposed to particular things outside of games, or is it the amount of games or different developers that you've worked on, games you play, like all of the above? Like, how would you, if you're telling folks, trust your intuition, what tools would you give them? What advice would you give them to be able to like sort of build and hone that intuition?
Well, I definitely think you said nurture, and that's a good way of thinking about it. Like I said, every time that I had to try and explain to these other designers and developers that I have great admiration for and respect for, and I have to convince them that actually, no, I know best in this specific case. I had to really, really dig for some really good reasons. And so in this reverse engineering your intuition, you sort of you take it apart, and then it grows stronger, I think, by that process of examination. Maybe I think that's maybe the closest I can get to an answer.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a great starting point for everyone who's listening, who's looking to develop their intuition and taste. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Congrats on the success you've seen so far. Critically, obviously the game's, reviewing super well, both from the public and, the press and everything. and it's doing numbers on Steam. So I'm just very proud of you as a peer, in the indie scene, and having followed a lot of your work over the years. It's just such a gargantuan effort, and I think we're all really looking forward to UFO 100, the 90s of UFO soft. So keep us posted, right?
Thank you.
Everyone who can't see their faces, that joke was not appreciated whatsoever. It's too soon to make that joke, it seems. But what is next? Seriously, what are you guys doing? You taking a big break? Are you just hanging out?
In the meantime, I think we still have some work to do on UFO 50. But as far as next projects, I think everyone's pretty excited to not have any commitments for the meantime.
Love that for you all. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining us here today. I do wish you all the continued success and, really, really something special that you've created. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.